20 April 1968. A crowded hotel room in Birmingham. A Conservative MP steps up to the lectern, notes in hand. Enoch Powell is already known as a brilliant, difficult man, a classical scholar turned soldier turned politician. But the speech he is about to give will mark him forever. He warns of the river Tiber foaming with much blood. He reads letters from anxious constituents. He paints a picture of a Britain transformed by immigration, and many hear not warning but threat. Within hours, Powell is sacked from the shadow cabinet. Within days, dockers and meat porters are marching in his support. He is denounced as dangerous and hailed as heroic, often by the same country. So who was Enoch Powell, really? A clear-eyed prophet of social tension, or the man who poured fuel on Britain's racial anxieties? In this episode, we follow his journey. From shy classics prodigy to wartime brigadier, from rising Conservative star to outcast, and finally to a figure whose ideas still echo in Britain's arguments about race, nation, and Europe. To understand Enoch Powell the Firebrand, you have to start with Enoch Powell the SWAT. He was born in 1912 in Birmingham into a lower-middle-class family that saw education as a way up. His parents pushed him hard, and he pushed himself even harder. At school, Powell raced through Greek and Latin, mastering languages most children never even see. Teachers remembered a boy who not only wanted to be top of the class, but top of the country. He won a scholarship to Trinity College, Cambridge, and there his ambition went into overdrive. Powell didn't just study classics, he tried to conquer them. By his early 20s, he had produced serious academic work and set himself an extraordinary goal: to become a professor of Greek at Cambridge by the age of 30. He didn't quite hit that target, but he came remarkably close. Instead, he became one of the youngest ever professors at the University of Sydney in Australia. On paper, he had everything: prestige, a glittering career path, the life of a scholar. Then came the Second World War. Powell felt a deep, almost obsessive loyalty to Britain and the Empire. He gave up his academic post, came home, and joined the army as a private soldier. His intelligence and discipline saw him rise quickly through the ranks, working in military intelligence and eventually attaining the rank of brigadier by the end of the war. Those years left a mark. The war confirmed his belief in duty, hierarchy, and the importance of a united nation under pressure. It also cemented his sense of Britain as a distinct, sovereign power that had fought alone when it had to. These ideas about loyalty, cohesion, and the fragility of states under strain would later shape his views on immigration, empire, and Europe. After the war, Powell decided that ideas alone were not enough. He wanted power, the ability to shape Britain's future, not just comment on its past. In 1950, he was elected Conservative MP for Wolverhampton South West. It wasn't automatic. He'd failed to win earlier seats, and he was no natural backslapping campaigner. But once in Parliament, he stood out. His speeches were dense, precise, and often brutal. Colleagues sometimes found him cold, even arrogant, but they also recognized a first-rate mind. Powell built a reputation as a fierce critic of the post-war economic consensus. While both major parties accepted a large state role in the economy, he pushed instead for tight money, lower spending, and market discipline. At the time, it sounded unfashionable, even extreme, but some of his ideas would later echo in Thatcherism. His big step up came in 1960, when he was appointed Minister of Health. Here, Powell surprised people. Far from just talking theory, He drove a large hospital building program and reorganized parts of the National Health Service. Even critics admitted he was an efficient technocrat who could master a brief and drive reform. But he never stopped being his own man. In 1963, when Alec Douglas Home became Conservative leader, Powell refused to serve under him, an extraordinary act of defiance in a party that valued loyalty. To many colleagues, this looked like near-suicidal pride. In 1965, he even ran for the party leadership himself, although he had little real chance of winning. By the mid-1960s, Enoch Powell was both inside the establishment and fundamentally at odds with it, a senior Tory who seemed determined to challenge his own party's direction. At the same time, the country around him was changing fast. Post-war Britain had encouraged workers from across the Commonwealth to help rebuild the country, from the Caribbean, from India and Pakistan, from parts of Africa. In towns like Wolverhampton, new communities grew quickly. For many white Britons, this was their first real encounter with large-scale racial diversity. For some, it meant new neighbours and new friends. For others, it sparked unease and resentment. For Powell, immigration was no longer a distant, abstract topic. It was on the doorstep of his own constituency. On paper, he was clear. The law should treat all citizens equally, regardless of race. He opposed formal discrimination and insisted that everyone who was legally in Britain was fully British in the eyes of the state. He supported the idea that the law must be colour-blind. But underneath that principle was a very different fear. Powell believed that a shared national culture, language, customs, historical memory, was fragile. He worried that large, rapid inflows of people with different backgrounds would not simply blend in, but form separate communities with their own loyalties. In speeches and essays, he drew on his knowledge of history and empire, pointing to places where divided societies had slid into conflict. Constituency letters reinforced this view. People wrote to him about overcrowded housing, pressure on schools, changing neighbourhoods. Some concerns were about services, others were clearly about race. Powell tended to treat them all as warnings of a deeper fracture coming. By 1967, his speeches on immigration had grown sharper, more urgent. He was no longer just raising questions. He was sounding an alarm. All that tension was building toward one explosive moment in 1968. On the morning of 20th April that year, Enoch Powell knew he was about to cross a line. He was Shadow Defense Secretary, a serious contender for future party leadership. The venue was a Conservative meeting in Birmingham, not the House of Commons, and the audience was local activists, not the whole nation. But Powell had written a speech that he understood would be explosive. He reportedly told a friend, "It's the most important speech I shall ever deliver, and one of the best." He also admitted, "I may be destroyed by it." From the start, the tone was stark. He read out letters from white constituents who said they felt strangers in their own country, describing streets where, they claimed, English was no longer spoken in shops and where they feared for their elderly relatives. He presented these not just as complaints, but as warnings of what lay ahead for the whole of Britain. Then came the line that would define him. Reaching back to his classical training, Powell quoted the Roman poet Virgil. "Like the Roman, I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much blood." It was a dramatic image. Civil conflict, chaos, the state losing control. To supporters, it sounded like a hard truth about unmanaged change. To critics, it sounded like a prediction, even a threat of racial violence. Powell argued that continued immigration and new race relations laws would create a divided country, where the majority felt powerless and minorities were treated as a protected class. He called for an end to large-scale immigration and for incentives to encourage repatriation of immigrants already in Britain. The reaction was immediate. News of the speech reached Conservative leader Edward Heath quickly. Within 24 hours, Powell was dismissed from the shadow cabinet. The political establishment and much of the press condemned his words as inflammatory and irresponsible. Church leaders, trade unionists, and anti-racist campaigners lined up to criticize him. For many in the political class, he had crossed from tough debate into open incitement, dragging race relations into a dark place. But outside Westminster, the story was more complicated and far more troubling for British politics. The days after the speech showed just how split Britain really was. Thousands of letters of support poured into Powell's office. Opinion polls at the time suggested that a clear majority of the public agreed with his warnings on immigration, even if they were unsure about his language. Dockers and meat porters marched in London with banners supporting him. Taxi drivers played recordings of his speech. He had lost his front bench job, but he had gained something else, a passionate, angry base. Electorally, he remained strong. He held his seat in Wolverhampton with increased majorities. In some working-class areas, Powell, who was nothing like an old Etonian grandee, became a hero of plain speaking, the man who said what others would not. At the same time, far-right groups such as the National Front tried to ride on his name, even though Powell never formally joined them and did not present himself as a fascist. This blurred the line between mainstream conservative anxiety about immigration and openly racist politics. For many Black and Asian Britons, Powell's words and the movements that rallied behind him felt like a direct threat. Inside Parliament, both main parties tightened immigration controls in the 1970s. Historians still argue over how much this was directly driven by Powell and how much by broader social pressures, economic downturn, urban tensions, global change. But either way, debates about immigration would now always carry a shadow, the fear of another Enoch Powell. By the early 1970s, Powell's main battlefield was no longer just immigration, it was Europe. He saw Britain's entry into the European Economic Community as a betrayal of national sovereignty. For a man who had fought in a war for king and country, the idea of sharing laws and powers with a supranational body was intolerable. When the Conservatives under Edward Heath pushed ahead with joining Europe, Powell broke ranks in dramatic fashion. In the February 1974 election, he told his supporters to vote Labour because Labour promised a referendum on Europe. It was a stunning move, a lifelong conservative urging people to back his party's historic rival. Later that year, Powell returned to Parliament as MP for South Down in Northern Ireland, representing the Ulster Unionists. There, he became a fierce defender of the Union, opposing power sharing with Irish nationalists and warning that devolution could tear the UK apart. He argued for a strong, centralised British state and against any settlement that, in his view, weakened the link between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. In this later phase, Powell helped shape early Eurosceptic thought and hardline unionism, even from the political sidelines. He was no longer a central figure at Westminster, but his speeches still carried weight among those who feared both European integration and the breakup of the United Kingdom. So what do we do with Enoch Powell now? On one level, his political career failed. He never led his party. He never held high office again after 1968. Many of his constitutional positions, especially on Northern Ireland, were pushed aside by later governments. In that narrow sense, he was not a winner. And yet, his shadow is long. The language and themes he used in 1968, worries about rapid cultural change, questions about national identity, resentment over not being listened to, still appear in British debates today, from immigration policy to arguments over Europe and national belonging. Some see him as a man who spotted early the strains that mass migration and European integration could produce. Others see him as someone who intensified those strains, giving racial fear a respectable voice. Among historians, there is rough agreement on 2 points. First, Powell was genuinely brilliant, a serious intellectual, an able minister, and a powerful orator. Second, his 1968 speech inflicted real damage on race relations, making it harder to discuss immigration without suspicion and fear. Was he Britain's most controversial MP? Perhaps. More importantly, he became a symbol of both the dangers of inflammatory rhetoric and the deep anxieties that can run beneath a changing society. So, here's the question to leave you with. Did Enoch Powell simply reveal tensions that were already there, or did his words help create the very divisions he warned about?